Meanwhile, talking about the China situation, U.S.-China trade, of course, we have seen quite a turnaround from last night as China came back and asked the Trump administration to negotiate. Here to talk is attorney and legal expert Byron Henry. SolidCounsel.com is the website. All right, Byron, there are so many different facets to this whole Trump-China trade deal and the trade war that's played out to this point. But the one that was really interesting late last week, the president saying, hey, you know what, I could declare a national emergency and force U.S. companies out of the manufacturing in China. So what say you about the potential legality of the president if he issued that kind of a national declaration?
Well, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act basically gives the president the authority, which it was passed and signed by Jimmy Carter, Democratic House, Democratic Senate, and signed by Jimmy Carter. It was a scale back of the president's authority, mind you. This was to rein in presidential authority with respect to unilateral actions of significance worldwide, but basically gives the president broad authority for national security risks or emergencies to deal with national security, foreign diplomacy or foreign policy, as well as economic interests, the economy of the United States. So it doesn't necessarily mean in response to terrorism, although that's when it's been most widely used, humanitarian issues and terrorism, such as after 9/11, after the Iranians took the hostages at the U.S. Embassy, which, by the way, that emergency is technically still in effect. That declared emergency from all the way back then is still in effect today. But it gives him a wide range of powers, including acting against governments, entities, or individuals. And he could basically, while he can't order companies out of China, his tweet was basically a warning to prepare to disentangle from China, because he could issue sanctions and all the way up to basically a trade embargo that could make it impossible to do business in China for these companies. So this warning was, if he uses this act, they would not be able to do business. He can't force them to leave. They can continue to lose money, shut down their plants, and stay there, but they couldn't effectively do business if they were American companies with manufacturing arms in China. And so I think that's what he's saying. Now, it's legal. The president is supposed to consult with Congress first in some form or fashion, the act doesn't say, and then report to Congress every 6 months thereafter. And then annually, once a year, the Congress can by concurrent resolution, which is a majority of the House and the Senate, on the same resolution, declare that the emergency the president used is not either wasn't an emergency or is no longer an emergency, therefore the powers are not necessary. The actions are no longer necessary. So that's the check Congress put on the president, but it's an annual review, and within that time, it's basically unilateral for the president to decide what the emergency is. He needs to state it in writing. He needs to declare the emergency in writing. He needs to say whether it's national security, foreign policy, economic, or all three, and then he can move under the act without congressional oversight as long as he reports within 6 months.
And Byron, you mentioned this became law under the Carter administration. Are there any examples of this having been used?
Yes, it's been used dozens of times with respect to bad regimes in Nicaragua. Of course, the Iranians I've already mentioned. After 9/11, there was the president invoked a national emergency with respect to national security, with respect to anybody aiding or abetting terrorist entities or terrorist countries, meaning it doesn't have to be against a country, by the way. I mean, it is anything that threatens the national security, foreign policy, or economy of the United States. It needs to be an unusual emergency, an extraordinary emergency, not just a bump in the road, and it also needs to be something that originates in whole or in part outside the United States. But President Trump and Congress have been working on the intellectual property thefts and the electronic espionage by China in this country for years. So that alone, separate and apart from the trade war, could give the president all the ground he needs to declare a national emergency on national security grounds, not just economic grounds with respect to some of China's behavior, and really put China on the defensive in that respect. But I do believe the president has the authority to do it. The prudential use of this power, how you use it in consultation with Congress and how it affects the economy, is something that we need to be concerned with. And of course, the president threatened to use it with Mexico when he said he would close the border and impose sanctions, and of course he never had to. So in some of these cases, the threat is valuable as the actual using of the power. The president has a lot of tools in his toolbox. This is one of them. This is more of a sledgehammer as opposed to a more intricate tool. This is basically the biggest sledgehammer the president has outside of military options.
So
countries.
You mentioned this would have to be extraordinary, and that to me would seem to suggest there would need to be something that has changed that would bring this about. If we take a look at the currency manipulation and the intellectual property theft, for example, by China, that's not new, right? If they're still doing it, that's just been business as usual for them. Do you think if somebody did legally challenge this, there is enough of an extenuating circumstance that the courts would uphold the presidential authority?
The authority in the act, since it comes from Congress, this isn't just the president trying to expand the Article 1 power or Article 2 powers of the presidency. This is an act of Congress signed by the president, giving the president this authority and not curtailing the president's discretion to declare an extraordinary emergency. So while I'm not saying courts have no role to play. Courts are important in enforcing separation of powers. Anytime you have the legislative branch of government delegating to the executive branch in a legitimate form, in the form of a law, authority to do something to protect the country, it would be extraordinary for the courts to step in and say, you don't have this authority when Congress didn't even reign the president's authority, and they're the ones that would have the economic power, and the president has the foreign policy power. The courts have neither. So I would find it extraordinary for a court to step in and try to put some restrictions into the act that don't exist there already. It doesn't mean it's unlimited. It just means that President Trump would have to way overstep his bounds. And I think China has been on everyone's radar for a while, and what's happened recently is just additional fodder for the Trump administration. I mean, just the electronic espionage issue and the theft of what some experts have said, $500 billion worth of intellectual property a year is grounds enough to take action against China, let alone the manipulating currency and the other issues that have been going on there for years. But I just think that the courts are not the answer here. This is going to be how it plays with the public, how the economy reacts, and how the media react. I mean, it's going to be a political thing within the country, not a legal thing. I don't think will ultimately decide this.
Well, it's a good explanation. We appreciate you bringing it to us. Byron Henry, solidcounsel.com is the website.